Hi everyone. We are doing a mini YouTube today in response to a lot of the online and elsewhere conversations around Harrison Butker's graduation speech at Bendectine College in Kansas, where among other things, he said a lot of things that we could comment on, but among other things, he spoke specifically to the women in the audience, presumably the women graduating who probably, I imagine, amount to 50% of the graduating class or more, because data shows that there are more female graduates than male graduates from four-year undergraduate institutions. And he said that the best thing they could do is to embrace being a homemaker. And he used homemaker as the terminology. And so I think there's a lot there. I think there's been kind of conversation back and forth about, who cares what he said. It's not unexpected. He's a very outwardly and vocally Catholic man who has spoken before about his belief about gender and sexuality and politics. He was in the speech very critical of COVID policies. He was very critical of Joe Biden, particularly Joe Biden as a Catholic, very critical of any conversation around the right to choose, very critical around birth control and reproductive justice, very critical around conversation around gender identity and sexuality, and kind of exuded this narrative that we are lost as a society because we are not following Catholic principles. And while I am not Catholic at all, and I personally don't agree with anything he said, I think there are aspects of the speech that, but for some of the things he said, I would have just ignored, right? There are things that I imagine at a religiously based educational institution are going to have religious flavor. I think where I take the most issue and find the most problematic is two things. One, him speaking on behalf of his wife, right? He very clearly said, if my wife were here right now, she would say blah, 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 blah. I find that actually deeply inappropriate, and we can talk about why. And then this idea of when is it not okay to tell people how to live their lives? And what are the purpose of graduation speeches, right? So I would argue it's never appropriate to tell someone how to live their life. So do you live your life however you want. You want to be in a totally normative, heteronormative, cis heteronormative marriage and have children and not use birth control and not use intervention if you can't be pregnant, can't get pregnant. Like, that is your choice. But if you want to choose something different, if you don't want to have children, if you can't have children, if you can't afford to have children, if you're in an abusive relationship and don't want to partner and parent with someone, those are also your choices. And the idea of someone without any context giving people advice about how to live is deeply problematic. The other is this idea, and I was thinking, like, what about this feels so wrong? And I think if he had just said, look, here is my experience as someone who went, by the way, he went to Georgia Tech. He did not go to Benedictine College. I believe he went to Georgia Tech. We can check on that, but he did not go to this college. But if he had just had a graduation speech that followed his own experiences, right? And even woven in his own experience as a Catholic, right? This is what I learned from being a Catholic at my four-year institution. This is how Catholic principles guided my education or guided my postgraduate education. Here is how Catholicism impacts my life. Here's how I weave it into my practice as a football player, or my practice as a husband, or my practice as a father, or as a community member. That actually, I think, wouldn't bother me, particularly given the context, right? That this is a Catholic school. But we don't know. But the fact that he was speaking for his wife is inappropriate. The other is, and I imagine this is going to resonate with a lot of our viewers or people who listen to us, is people end up in spaces for all sorts of reasons. So I know personally, and I'm friends with people who ended up at certain colleges or certain environments, not because of a desire to be affiliated with that organization or that religion even, but because that's where they ended up getting in, or that's the place they could afford, or that's the place they knew of, right? I think it's wildly presumptive to assume that everyone in the audience who completed a 4-year degree has the same religious practice, right? There's so much nuance within religion. So someone can be a Catholic, I imagine, in a particular way, and someone else can be a Catholic in another way. And who are we as humans to opine? I know that people might not agree with me on that one, but I mean, that's okay. You don't have to agree with me. And so there's also that, right? There are a lot of people in that audience who might hold Catholicism in a different light, and went to that school because maybe that was their only choice. The other is that it is a college, right? So no matter what people individually want for their lives, they all completed a 4-year course of study that either aligned with their professional aspirations or their intellectual academic pursuits. So they may want to immediately start having a family, but that's not why you go to college. And I actually just had this conversation with a really close family member of mine who has made the choice to stay home primarily and pause her career to have children. I do believe there is a version of deciding to primarily parent that can be a feminist choice. If it's a choice. If it is an active choice that someone isn't making for you, that isn't being told that you need to do this to be a good parent, right? The whole kind of idea is if it's a choice. When stuff no longer becomes a choice and is pushed on you, whether it's to have a child or not have a child, or to act a certain way, or to enter the workforce or not enter the workforce, or do anything that no longer is a choice, I would argue is abusive. And so that's where the speech sits so deeply incorrectly or wrong for me. There's other aspects of the speech too that aren't getting as much play that I find equally scary. He talks about the immorality of kind of living with people you're dating before you're married. I mean, okay, great. Like, we all know that, like, sex before marriage, theoretically, well, we all know that some religions think that sex before marriage is a sin, or cohabitating with a partner before marriage is a sin. Practically speaking, particularly in this economy, it's not always a choice. You can't necessarily live independently or afford to. And also, it's good practice, because many people, when they live with their partners, realize that they're not meant to be together. And separating, even though that's a very difficult thing in a romantic relationship, is way better than getting divorced down the road. There's also, he also kind of spoke very negatively about IVF, about birth control. In doing this kind of opining about what a real family is pathologizing and maligning families that don't look like his, right? So who is he? He is a very young man. I believe he is 28 years old. I believe he has 2 or 3 children. I believe he married his middle school sweetheart. He went from high school to college to playing football, which we can all agree is not a typical job. And 28 is still very young. So I am not taking away any of the life experiences this person has had. He's had quite a bit for his young life, but he is still a very young man. To put it in perspective, at the onset of COVID, he was 24 years old. Right. So we all know how COVID kind of interrupted. He talked a lot about COVID and how bad COVID policies were. But I think a lot of us can frame timing by March 2020 and where we were. And I think we can also probably agree that 24 is very, very young. And the last 4 years have not been typical years, right? So we all, depending on where we are in our own human development, know how COVID has stunted a lot of us. So I'll just put that out there too. I also wonder, and I've never done a kind of college graduation speech, and I'm not really one for respectability politics, obviously, but I do wonder if this kind of uproar centers this idea of who, when, and why do we comment on people's individual decisions, and what is the purpose of speeches or advice, right? And who are we getting advice from? I think kind of we hold up certain people, particularly, people who play sports, as experts, but in many ways, particularly young people who play sports, have had a very stunted and sheltered life. And why are we looking to those people to give advice to people who are not going to have an NFL contract upon graduation, are going to have to work an hourly job, are going to have to figure out how to pay their loans? And so I understand that it's like always inspiring to kind of see people who kind of have obtained a certain level of success, but I'm not entirely convinced that he's the right person to be getting advice from, particularly at graduation. Another thing that is happening kind of in this echo chamber of normative family values, right, is this narrative that coastal elites or progressive spaces, people are so miserable, right, and unhappy. And I think in every environment, there are people who are unhappy. There's good reason for people to be unhappy right now. The world is in a very tenuous place. And we've talked a lot about that on the podcast. But there's something really interesting happening where the religious right is framing progressive individuals as miserable and unhappy, particularly progressive women. And it's because they're progressive and they're loose and they're independent and they focused on their jobs and their academic careers. And because of that, they're miserable and alone and they don't have families in a particular way. And so maybe it's our job to counter that narrative. I don't know. I'm really happy. I'm very progressive. I have focused a lot of my energy in my life and continue to on my professional development and professional aspirations. I have made the choice to have children, right? And so I'm one person, but I think, and a lot of people that I'm in community with, I would say are happy people and are happy with the choices that they've made and are okay with the sacrifices they've made in the different spaces. I mean, no one is ever completely happy because balance is an illusion. But I think maybe it's our job to start counteracting that narrative, right? That there is a lot of joy and a lot of kind of spirituality and peace and enlightenment kind of by all people, right? Not just people who live a certain way, who are very religious and who have decided to procreate as their only goal. So that's just another piece of it. Like I'm tired of hearing about kind of the misery of women I think there's a lot of reason to be fearful as women in this country right now. I think there's a war on women. I think there's a war on Black women in particular. I think that's very scary, but there is a lot of reason to be joyful. And I think that is something that maybe we can start kind of highlighting a little bit more to get some traction. The other piece that kind of, I think maybe we can't agree with, but like I put it out there as something I feel is, can we agree or can we have a conversation not to speak on behalf of other people, no matter who those people are? And I think it's like, right, you can know people really well. You can hypothesize how they're going to respond. You can advocate for other people, of course, particularly when they're unable to do so for themselves. But this idea of speaking on behalf of other people, even children, is deeply disconcerting. So in this context, right, he directly speaking on behalf of his wife, he said multiple times, if my wife were here, she would say, well, sir, your wife isn't here. So why don't you keep her out of your mouth? Because now you've set her up that if she ever decides to make any other decisions for herself or for your family, if she decides to work outside of the home, if she decides to use birth control, if she decides to plan when she wants or doesn't want to get pregnant, if she decides to leave you or make other decisions about how she wants to live her life, her narrative about her life has already been explained to everyone by you, not by her. So we don't even know what she wants. And maybe it is exactly as he described it. I mean, that is quite possible. But also, was it her choice to be put out in the graduation speech as you did or as he did? We don't know. And so that part also feels like a violation or something, and just kind of a boundary, particularly because he was speaking about something so intimate and personal. And I think I wonder what other people think, but I have no issue with people deciding to live their lives, ascribing to certain rules and regulations. I know religion and conformity to a prescribed way of living can give people a lot of peace. Having structure, having a routine, having ritual around ceremony and holidays, and going to a religious place in each city you go to can give people a lot of community and belonging. And that can happen to people through all different ways. And religion is one of those ways that is a huge part in a lot of people's lives. I have no issue with that. Where I think kind of we want to end with is the speech like really struck a nerve for a lot of people. And there's a reason why. And what can we take from that and learn from? Because we don't want this speech to have gone viral and everyone talking about it for nothing. There's a reason. There's also a reason in his speech he talked about kind of the success or expansion of religiously affiliated traditional schools. That's true. And there's a reason for that. We can't ignore that. It's not even necessarily a bad thing, but kind of where does that intersect with a boundary being crossed and an assumption being made about every individual in that space?
Thanks for listening to Justice. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to learn more about our podcast, be sure to check us out on our website at justicepodcast.com. You can also reach out to us there if you want to be featured on the show or if you have a business or a product that you think would be a good fit for our audience. Thanks again for listening.